So we've been going through this nice review paper on the scales at which responses in the plants are elicited or brought out because of the warming. We talked from molecular to biosphere level responses, many of which we know but not quantified exactly how strong or weak they are, or we just don't know sometimes, that we guess there must be responses. Sometimes the responses are multiple and cannot be separated from each other and so on. The terms I used, the Thurger pressure, I assume that you know it. Basically, cells have a hard cover, and then there is a membrane inside. So osmotically the water pressure inside is adjusted so that the membrane can expand to the out to the hard cell. That's called Thurger pressure. It's kind of a hydrostatic pressure, and we said embolism, which is a process where air bubbles can get in during the take up of water through the roots, and they can block the transport of water within the plants, and that's something plants have to deal with. So embolism, we mentioned that. Megathermy, homeothermy, poikilothermy, we said megathermy is where the leaf temperature is warming faster than the air temperature. Homeothermy is where it's warming slower, and then poikilothermy is where it's not changing. So we looked at the photosynthetic responses associated with megathermy, homeothermy, and poikilothermy, and these are generally done for spikes in temperatures like heat waves, or experiments where people spike the surrounding temperature to increase leaf temperatures as a response. Let's then conclude this nice paper with some future directions provided by the authors. As I said, I've been supremely brief, so you want to read the paper if you're interested in further details. The examples we looked at demonstrate recent progress in understanding how and why plant responses to heat or rising temperature change across scales, with a few key takeaways. First, individual plants and ecosystems exhibit self-stabilizing feedbacks, homeostasis, and emergent properties. Evolutionarily, you expect that living things will try to maintain status quo or have some ability to do homeostasis. There is the idea of Gaia, which was proposed as life having evolved to control the environment, which hasn't quite worked out yet, but at individual species level, that's still a mechanism that's available for their own functioning. Some of these stabilizing mechanisms operate on shorter time scales, such as instantaneous adjustments of transpiration for evaporative cooling, biochemical acclimation of photosynthesis, or canopy scale buffering of air temperature. Others operate on intermediate to longer time scales, from leaf shedding and adjustments of above to below ground biomass ratio to adaptive evolution and species range shifts. Each has the potential to modify plant or ecosystem responses to heat, complicating cross-scale prediction. So when we talk about species shifting in space and responding, we are talking about evolutionary traits. And remember that most plants haven't invested in mobility. They stand where they are, and then they use pollinators to do the work of reproduction or fertilizing the eggs and so on. But there are ways in which plants use the environment and birds and so on to actually switch or move as well, right? The second point is that plants have evolved diverse mechanisms or strategies for responding to heat and drought. Tendency has been to focus on a relatively limited set of plant traits or processes, such as stomatal responses or leaf gas exchange, when plants operate in a multidimensional space of traits, trade-offs, and compensatory mechanisms. So it's not a one response that works in all locations or all situations. So obviously there are multiple things, optimizations, trade-offs, turning down photosynthesis to deal with heat and so on. We recommend considering plant functioning more holistically with respect to plant organs, so consider leaves, stems and roots, as well as traits of the plants, the dynamic and intertwined nature of temperature, water and carbon status, and the ways that plants modify their environment. Plants are affecting their environment. As I mentioned, Gaia is about them actively controlling the environment, whereas it may be more subtle than that, where evaporative cooling and transpiration changes obviously have at least microclimate impacts depending on the scale of the vegetation response or scale of the biosphere or ecosystem that's responding. A corollary is that this diversity of buffering or self-stabilizing mechanisms likely leads to resilience, but resilience within limits. You can't push the system to random perturbations, random scales of perturbations, and expect the ecosystem to remain resilient or species to remain resilient. Self-stabilizing feedbacks should also generate tipping points or threshold behavior, which creates a great deal of uncertainty in predictions of the future. So we assume that there are temperatures thresholds beyond which the ecosystem or plants species may collapse. We call them tipping points, and considering all the unknowns, it's probably dangerous to make those claims right now anyways, especially in terms of predictions. Moving forward, given the pitfalls of the both bottom-up mechanistic and top-down statistical approaches to scaling that we briefly looked at, we suggest that progress can be made by systematically comparing patterns and predictions from data at different scales, or by combining complementary sources of data, such as through hierarchical Bayesian state space models or data assimilation, which is technical terms. Data assimilation is where you have a model based on some principles and you are going to assimilate data to create a blended products to understand better the dynamically interpolated system approach to, like in this case, ecosystem or plant responses to heating or warming. And Bayesian state space models are a bit more complicated, but if you don't know, don't worry about it. In addition, empirical or statistical models can be made more mechanistic by adopting causal inference approaches, which entail explicit representation of known or hypothesized cause-effect relationships, and this should help address the potential for misattribution of causality in spatial regression or space-time approaches. For example, we also suggest hybridizing or blending inferential approaches. Without knowing the details, you may feel lost with it, but basically if you are looking at a plant, let's say, and you are looking at multiple factors of the context of its ecosystem, the context of its environment with individual variables like temperature, precipitation, humidity and so on, you can do these networks to see all the linkages that determine the plant's response to just heat, and then you can try to understand which are the main drivers and what it implies for understanding the overall ecosystem response, for example. Okay, I will just leave it at that, but you can read up more. Modeling frameworks that are part of process-based, so that include processes known to be important, and part empirical, so machine learning or AI approaches that excel at describing patterns without really knowing anything about the mechanism. So they are physics agnostic or mechanism agnostic. They just look at the data and extract information. But these offer a promising path forward, and already they are being applied in many ways. Lastly, we recommend exploring additional currently understudied ways that plant responses to heat and drought may change across scales. Okay, so those are often called compound events. So you may get a heat wave, and depending on when it occurs, it may have very different impacts in terms of spatial and temporal scales, or what response is elicited in the plants from molecular to biosphere. So if you have a drought going on and the heat wave comes in at that time, it will obviously exacerbate many things, including vapor pressure deficit and so on. Okay. The examples highlighted here have been identified largely because of a historical focus on certain scales and processes, as well as the availability of particular types of data and instrumentation used to collect the data, such as infrared gas analyzer. This has led to a strong focus on photosynthesis rather than respiration, and as you imagine, we only mentioned respiration very casually in a schematic way, where we looked at here let me go back to the. So here we looked at reduction in water loss. So we are talking about respiration here, or increase in water loss when the leaf level responses happen, and there are tree level responses as well, right? But respiration is hardly mentioned in general, because most of the focus tends to be on photosynthesis. Okay. The second, where am I? Leaf sharing. Did I go through this? Yeah, I lost my spot in the PowerPoint, but doesn't matter. Second point, plants have evolved diverse mechanisms or strategies. We are reading this. The tendency has been to focus on relatively limited set of plants or processes, such as stomatal responses or leaf gas exchange. When plants operate in a multidimensional space of traits, trade-offs and compensatory mechanisms, this is kind of a limitation. Moving forward, given the pitfalls of the bottom-up mechanistic and top-down statistical approaches to scaling, we suggested that progress may be made by systematically comparing patterns and predictions from data at different scales. And then we were somewhere here at last recommendation, and we already mentioned AIML, etc., offering new ways of extracting information that's not coming from process level understanding, which tend to be based on data, but often AI can see things that we cannot just see with our simple inference models and so on. Given the given their importance, we should also expect soil characteristics such as texture, nutrient availability, and organic content, as well as microbial plant associates such as mycorrhizae, plant pathogens, and natural and anthropogenic disturbances to modify plant responses to heat or play a role in how the heat affects plants. Right? There is plant responses, which obviously determines how they are affected, and depends on the rate at which things are changing. Greater attention to these areas is essential for advancing a more complete understanding and better prediction of plant functioning in a changing climate. Pattern and scale has long been considered a central problem in ecology, if not in all of science. An awareness of the scale dependence of plant responses to heat is essential to correctly predict and mitigate the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, especially given the key role of the plants in both biodiversity and climate mitigation. Obviously, this is a kind of a obvious statement that we need to worry about these things, but considering the heterogeneity of species distributions, ecosystem compositions, and the way ecosystems change in response to heat. Plants respond in a certain way, ecosystems respond in a certain way. The more holistic questions about whether ecosystems are trying to optimize something on a longer time scale, and how that changes with rapid perturbations like warming is not clear, but nonetheless they are also important, because some species move, some don't move, and the newer ecosystem that may survive may be very different. How is it different in terms of its resilience to further perturbations, for example? Does the ecosystem itself optimize its structure in a way that it becomes more resilient, or is it just trying to survive with whatever remains? Those are kind of difficult questions anyways. Okay, so let's leave it here.